In this lesson, we'll be talking about infectious diseases within the cardiovascular and lymphatic systems. So just as a brief review, the cardiovascular system is composed of blood vessels which carry blood to and from all regions of the body, and then the heart, which obviously is the muscle that's responsible for pumping the blood throughout the body. Overall, the function of the cardiovascular system is to provide our organs and tissues with oxygenated blood and then also nutrients, and then also carry away carbon dioxide and waste products from those same organs and tissues. The lymphatic system is composed of lymph vessels, which typically parallel the blood vessels, and lymph nodes, which are found throughout our body. We have them in areas such as our groin, neck, armpit, intestines, and even our spleen. So collectively, the function of the lymphatic system is to collect fluid that has leaked out of the blood vessels, likely from the blood vessels becoming more permeable, and filter that fluid of any type of impurities or infectious agents, and then return that fluid back into the blood. So our cardiovascular and lymphatic system is highly protected by immune cells. So we have a very strong immune response throughout these areas. One of the primary reasons why we have a very strong immune response within these specific areas is because our cardiovascular and our lymphatic system, these systems run throughout every organ and tissue in our body. So if an infectious pathogen would get into, say, the blood, that infection can become systemic. It can spread throughout the entire body very fast because blood within blood vessels is going to be able to travel to organs and tissues throughout the body, and if there's an infectious pathogen in the blood, it can carry that infectious pathogen to all areas of the body, ultimately leading to a systemic infection. So our body wants to avoid that from happening, and for that reason, we have a very strong immune defense in those areas. So we have quite a few white blood cells, things like monocytes and neutrophils, which are phagocytic cells that can engulf and destroy pathogens. And then we have lymphocytes, things like T cells that can destroy pathogens and activate the rest of our immune system to produce things like antibodies that can mark pathogens for destruction. So collectively, we do have a very strong immune defense in this region of our body to prevent infections from becoming systemic and spreading throughout the body. So when someone has a condition involving blood, it will end in the suffix emia. So what you're probably most familiar with is the condition of anemia. What we're going to be talking about today are cases where individuals have microorganisms within their blood that is causing them to be in an infectious state. So if someone has virus in their blood, they are under a state of viremia. So, for example, individuals who have things like untreated HIV or hepatitis C or hepatitis B, they are going to be in states of viremia where there is virus present in the blood. Fungemia would be a case where there was fungi existing in the blood causing an infection. And then bacteremia is the presence of bacteria in the blood. Bacteremia, though, is usually a relatively small amount of bacteria that get into the blood, and our immune system is typically able to overcome it. What happens if you get a large amount of bacteria in the blood that your immune system is not able to initially overcome is you can get a case of what we call septicemia. Septicemia, or sepsis, is where bacteria are actively growing and flourishing in the blood. So these bacteria at this point would be overcoming the impact of your immune system, and they would be actively thriving and growing. This is a very dangerous, life-threatening situation. If someone is under a state of sepsis or septicemia, it could potentially lead to a condition that we call septic shock, What happens is if you have a large amount of bacteria in the blood and they're actively growing, it typically is going to cause the blood vessels to vasodilate, and they are going to start leaking too much fluid. They become too permeable, and that fluid is going to leak out into the existing tissues, and that leaking of the fluid is going to cause the blood pressure to drop. So if someone is in a state of septic shock, that means that their blood pressure is dropping extensively, and that means that they're no longer going to be able to get oxygenated blood to their organs and tissues, which, if left untreated, could lead to a coma and then ultimately death. So septicemia is very serious because it can lead to septic shock. Bacteremia is usually relatively mild. A common example of this is, you're brushing your teeth too hard, and you get a little bleeding in your gums, and some of the bacteria from your mouth get into the blood vessels of the gums. It's a low amount of bacteria. Your immune system's able to clear it relatively fast, but there is a short period of time where you're under a state of bacteremia. Now, if those bacteria get in and your immune system's not able to clear it, and those bacteria continue to grow, then you progress to having a septicemia, which can ultimately lead to septic shock. As far as normal biota, it's pretty easy here. There isn't any. We don't have any normal biota in the cardiovascular system or the lymphatic system. Those areas are completely closed to the external environment, so there's no normal biota presence there. If you ever have any bacteria or viruses, whether they're good or bad, in the cardiovascular lymphatic systems, your body is going to be actively trying to clear them because those areas are meant to be sterile. So you do not have normal biota in those areas of the body. So the first infectious disease that we'll talk about in this lesson is malaria. Malaria is a disease caused by a protozoan parasite. So it's not a bacteria or a viral infection, it's a protozoan infection. Specifically, the protozoan that causes malaria are protozoans within the Plasmodium genus. There are several different species within this genus that cause malaria, so you just need to know the genus name, which is Plasmodium. So protozoans within the Plasmodium genus can cause the condition or the disease that we know as malaria. This disease is transmitted through mosquitoes. So if a mosquito is infected with the Plasmodium protozoan and it bites you, when it injects its saliva into the bite wound, that saliva is going to have the Plasmodium protozoan in it, which it will then infect your body. This disease is primarily found in Africa. About 95% of cases of malaria come from Africa. There are other areas like South America and Asia where they have malaria too, but not nearly at the rate that we see it within Africa. So initially, when you become infected with this parasite, you will develop kind of non-specific signs or symptoms. These aren't certainly ones that you really need to remember, but because you wouldn't really, these signs and symptoms are present in all different types of infections, so you wouldn't probably necessarily think malaria right away. But you would have a fever, you'd be fatigued, you'd have nauseous, headache, maybe some muscle joint pain, but certainly nothing where you'd be thinking, oh, I definitely have malaria. Eventually, as the disease progresses, then you start to develop some more specific signs and symptoms. So the predominant sign that I do want you to know that happens in most malaria cases is something called hemolytic anemia. So the way the Plasmodium protozoan works is when it gets into the blood, that protozoan essentially feeds off of your red blood cells. It infects and then feeds off of the hemoglobin in the red blood cells, and then ultimately the red blood cells are destroyed. So patients become severely anemic, which can become problematic because then they're not able to get oxygen to their organs and tissues. So in most cases of malaria, patients will develop hemolytic anemia due to the destruction of red blood cells by the Plasmodium parasite. There is a complication that happens most often in young children, unfortunately, called cerebral malaria. So when the Plasmodium parasite feeds off of the red blood cells, initially those red blood cells will kind of start to clump together before they're completely destroyed. And when those red blood cells become kind of sticky and start to clump together, that can cause a blockage in blood vessels. And if it would cause a blockage within a blood vessel in the brain, it could lead to something called cerebral malaria. That blockage within the blood vessel in the brain is basically going to cut off the brain's oxygen supply. Ultimately, that could lead to a coma and then death. So while all patients will develop hemolytic anemia, cerebral malaria is a complication that's typically only seen amongst those that are more immunocompromised. So often when we see it, it's in, unfortunately, young children. But like I said, those red blood cells, before they're completely destroyed, tend to kind of clump together. That forms a blockage that could ultimately cut off the oxygen supply to the brain and cause coma and death. So with malaria, this parasite takes on different forms. So initially, if we look at this picture, so this little mosquito up here would be infected with the Plasmodium parasite. So when this mosquito bites a human host, it is going to inject its saliva into the human host, and it's going to take away some blood. In that saliva, there is going to be the Plasmodium parasite. Now, the Plasmodium parasite, when it's first injected into the human host, is going to be in a form that we call a sporozoite. So the first initial form is called a sporozoite. The sporozoite is going to travel via the blood to its first target, which is the liver. So the sporozoites are actually going to infect liver cells. That's going to allow the parasite to grow inside of the liver cells and kind of remain hidden from the immune system because it's going to be growing inside the liver cells where it can kind of hide away. So the sporozoites will target liver cells, and then the parasite will grow within the liver cells. Eventually, the liver cells are going to become so full of the parasite that they are going to burst, and that's going to release thousands and thousands of the parasite into the body. When the parasite is released from the liver cells, it takes on a new form. The new form of the parasite is called a merozoite. So as it leaves the liver cells, it takes on this new form called a merozoite. The merozoites are what's going to target the red blood cells. So the merozoites will travel through the blood and they will infect and destroy red blood cells. That ultimately creates cases of hemolytic anemia as the patients become severely anemic due to the destruction of the red blood cells by the parasite. And then obviously those red blood cells can clump together, which can cause cases of cerebral malaria as well. As far as prevention, mosquito control is the primary prevention. So in areas where malaria is present, protective clothing, netting, insecticide, avoiding still water where mosquitoes breed are all beneficial to prevent malaria. The same drugs, anti-malarial drugs that can be used to treat malaria can actually be used to prevent malaria. Quinine and chloroquine are two of the most common. So if you have malaria, you can take these drugs to treat it. But also, if you're traveling to an area where malaria is found, such as Africa, you would want to get put on these medications before your trip. That way, if you do get infected with the malaria parasite while you're on your trip, you'll already have these medications in your blood, and they are going to be able to destroy the parasite before the parasite's able to establish an infection. So just another example of why it's so important to check the CDC before you're traveling to another country, just to make sure you're cautious about what infectious diseases are endemic to that area and how you can prevent them, whether it's taking a medication or getting a vaccine. Now, there is a vaccine that's used for malaria, but it's only used in Africa amongst the child population. It's the RTS vaccine, but it's just a pediatric vaccine that can prevent severe cases of malaria in young children where the condition is endemic, where it has a constant presence. So this is only a vaccine that's administered amongst sub-Saharan African countries.